silences don't feel like silence at all. They feel like a verdict. My daughter-in-law started it. She's the one with the careful voice. The one who chooses her words the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel. Precise, deliberate, designed to cut without leaving a mark you can point to later. We were standing in my son's kitchen the week before Thanksgiving, and she said it so casually, like she was mentioning the weather. "We've been thinking it might be better for everyone if you sat out the holidays this year, just until things settle down a little." I said, "Sat out." She said, "You know how things get." I didn't argue. I've learned not to argue in that kitchen. My son was standing by the counter and he didn't say a word. That told me everything I needed to know about where we were. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time before going inside. That was November. I want to tell you about what happened by February, but first you need to understand who I was before any of this started. Because the man who got excluded from Thanksgiving is not the man I'm going to describe to you. Not entirely. In that gap, that distance between who I actually was and who my family had decided I was, that's what this whole story is really about. My name is Leonard. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the county. Bridges, overpasses, load-bearing retrofits on buildings that were built before anyone thought much about earthquakes or soil liquefaction or the way water moves through clay over decades. I was good at it, not in a way that gets written up in magazines, but in the way that matters. The work holds. The bridges I signed off on are still standing. The calculations I ran in 1994 kept a school gymnasium from collapsing during a 6.1 in 2019. No one called me about that. I read it in the paper. I retired at 61, not because I wanted to, but because my wife, Connie, we've been married 38 years. She had some health things that needed attention, and I wanted to be home. I wanted to be there. That's not something I regret. I want to be clear about that. Connie passed 14 months after I retired, pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and I was there for every single day of it. That's the part of my life I don't talk about much, because there isn't language for it that doesn't flatten it into something smaller than it was. She was my person. She's gone. I keep going. After she passed, I had time, more time than I knew what to do with. My son, Patrick, is 41. He lives about 20 minutes from me with his wife, Shelby, and their 2 kids, my grandchildren, Owen and Macy. Owen is 13, Macy is 10. They are good kids. I want to say that clearly, because what I'm about to describe is not about them. They didn't do anything wrong. Kids absorb the weather in a house, and they act accordingly. That's all they were doing. My daughter, Nora, is 37. She lives in Portland. She calls on birthdays and sometimes in between. She has her own life, and I don't hold that against her. We were never estranged, just not especially close. That's a different thing. After Connie died, I started going to Patrick's house more. Too much, probably. Grief does that. It pulls you toward the people who are left. I didn't always read the room correctly. I gave opinions when I should have listened. I pushed back on things. Parenting decisions, the way they were handling Owen's school situation, which I thought deserved more attention than it was getting. The remodel they were doing on the master bath, which I told Patrick was going to have drainage problems, and which, I will note, did eventually have drainage problems. I know how that sounds. I know the version of me that exists in that house. The opinionated father-in-law who shows up with unsolicited advice and a critical eye and never quite knows when to leave. I know that's real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But here's what I'll also tell you. I never once said anything I didn't believe to be true, and I never once said anything out of cruelty. Everything I said because I thought it would help. That distinction apparently meant nothing. By the time September rolled around, the year after Connie passed, I noticed things shifting. Invitations becoming suggestions. Suggestions becoming silences. Shelby started texting instead of calling. Patrick would check his phone during dinner. The kids were warm to me, but there was something careful about it, like they'd been coached not to bring up certain topics. I mentioned it to Patrick once, directly. I said, "I feel like I'm being managed." He said, "Dad, nobody's managing you. You just have strong opinions, and sometimes it's a lot. I said, tell me specifically what I've done. He said, it's not about specific things. That conversation went nowhere. I drove home and told Connie about it, which I still do sometimes, talk to her out loud, alone in the house. And I said, I don't think they know what they want from me, but they know they want less of it. She would have told me to give them space. She was always better at that than I was. I gave them space. 3 weeks went by and I didn't call. Patrick called on a Sunday and it was a normal conversation, surface level football and weather and how Owen's soccer team was doing. I thought maybe we'd reset. I thought maybe I'd earned my way back to neutral. Then came the week before Thanksgiving and Shelby's voice in that kitchen and sat out the holidays this year. I didn't tell Nora right away. I thought about calling her, but I didn't know what I would say. Your brother's wife told me not to come to Thanksgiving. It sounded pathetic. Even in my head, I was 62 years old and I'd been uninvited from my own family's holiday table. I couldn't make it sound like anything other than what it was. So I didn't tell her. I bought a turkey breast at the grocery store, just a breast because there was only going to be me. And I made a small Thanksgiving dinner by myself in the house I'd lived in for 27 years. The house where we'd raised both our kids, where Connie and I had hosted 30-something years of holidays, and the kitchen still had her handwriting on the inside of the cabinet door where she'd written down her pie crust recipe in 1998 because she kept forgetting the butter-to-flour ratio. I ate at the kitchen table. I watched a game I didn't care about. I went to bed at 9:30. I'm not telling you this to generate sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to understand where I was, mentally, that winter. And what I did with it. Before I retired, during the last several years of my career, I'd been working on something on the side. Not secretly. Connie knew. Patrick knew in a vague way, but not advertised either. It was a structural analysis methodology, a way of modeling load distribution in older infrastructure that was faster and more accurate than the standard approaches. Particularly for bridges built before 1975, they used design assumptions we now know were flawed. It sounds dry. It is dry, but what it means in practice is this. There are approximately 11,000 bridges in the United States that are classified as structurally deficient. Inspecting them thoroughly costs time and money that most county and state agencies don't have. My methodology, if it worked the way I believed it worked, could cut the assessment time by roughly 60% and flag high-risk structures with significantly better precision than existing tools. I'd been refining it for 6 years. The math was solid. I knew the math was solid because I'd run it against historical data from 14 bridge failures going back to 1967, and it had correctly predicted stress failure points in 11 of them. The other 3 had confounding variables I could account for but not model cleanly. What I didn't have was software, a real working software implementation that an engineer at a county agency could actually use. I had spreadsheets, essentially. Very sophisticated spreadsheets. But to turn this into something deployable, something that could actually get used in the field, I needed to build it properly. So that's what I did that winter. I taught myself enough Python over the years to be dangerous. I knew my limitations. I'm a structural engineer, not a software developer, so I was methodical about it. I bought books. I took online courses, 2 of them at 62 years old, sitting at my kitchen table with reading glasses and a legal pad. I asked questions in forums and got mostly helpful answers, and occasionally got talked down to by people a third my age, which I ignored. I worked on it every day, 4 hours in the morning, sometimes more. Patrick would call on Sundays and ask what I'd been up to, and I'd say, working on a project, and he'd make a sound that meant Dad and his projects and change the subject. I let him change the subject. I'd stopped explaining myself by then. By February, I had something that actually ran, a working prototype that took input data, bridge construction year, design type, traffic load, maintenance history, observable deficiency markers, and produced a risk assessment with failure probability ranges. I ran it against my historical dataset again. It performed better than the spreadsheets had, meaningfully better. I printed the output, sat with it for a long time, and then called the one person I trusted to tell me the truth about it. His name is Walter Osei. He's 54. He works for a civil engineering consultancy in Denver, and I've known him since 1997 when he was a junior engineer on a county project I was supervising. We'd stayed in touch over the years, not closely, but the kind of staying in touch where you know the person is in your corner if you need them. I called him and said, "I've built something and I need someone to tell me if it's real or if I've lost my mind." He said, "Send it." I sent him everything. The methodology documentation, the software, the historical validation data, all of it. I told him to take his time. He called me back in 4 days. That surprised me. I expected 2 weeks, maybe more. He said, "Leonard, where has this been?" I said, "My garage, essentially." He said, "This is real. This is actually real. Do you understand what this could be worth?" I said I had some idea, but I've been trying not to think about that part. He said, "I'm going to make some calls. Don't do anything with this until I call you back." I said, "Okay." He called back in 11 days with a name, Clifton Drawe, a partner at an infrastructure technology firm out of Atlanta that specialized in exactly this kind of assessment tool. Walter had described the methodology to him in general terms, and Clifton wanted a meeting. I flew to Atlanta in March. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous in years. Not about the work, I was certain about the work, but about the room. About being a 62-year-old retired county engineer with reading glasses and no business development experience walking into a conference room full of people who spoke a language I only partially knew. I brought my documentation, all of it, organized the way I organize everything, clearly labeled, cross-referenced, the kind of presentation that only makes sense to another engineer, and that makes people in business development visibly impatient. Clifton Drawe was not impatient. He went through it page by page. He asked good questions. He brought in someone else about an hour in, a younger guy whose title I didn't catch, and that guy asked even better questions. At the end of the meeting, Clifton leaned back in his chair and said, "What do you want out of this?" I said. "I want it to be used. I want the bridges that are going to fail to get flagged before they fail." He said, "That's a good answer." "What else?" I said. "I want to be compensated fairly for what I've built." He said, "Also a good answer." The next 3 months were negotiation. I hired an attorney, a woman named Vera, who came recommended by a colleague of Walter's and who turned out to be worth every dollar of her fee, and we went through multiple rounds of term sheets. Licensing versus acquisition, royalty structures, implementation rights. I learned more about intellectual property law in those 3 months than in the previous 6 decades of my life. I want to tell you about something Vera said to me early in that process. I'd come in to sign some documents and she looked up from the file and said, "Did you disclose this methodology to your employer at any point before you retired?" I said, "I kept it completely separate. Personal time, personal equipment, no county data, no county resources." She said, "Do you have documentation of that?" I said, "I have 7 years of personal lab notebooks with dates and I can account for every piece of data I used." She said, "Good, because they're going to ask." They did ask. My former employer submitted a formal inquiry. Vera handled it. It took 6 weeks to resolve, and in the end, there was no valid claim. I'd been meticulous. But those 6 weeks were not comfortable. I'm putting that in here because the people in the comments of videos like this always ask about it. And the answer is yes, that's a real risk. And yes, you need to have documentation. And yes, you should talk to an attorney before you do anything. The deal closed in late June. I'm not going to give you a number because Vera advised against that. And I think she's right. What I'll tell you is that it was more money than I expected. And I had expected quite a bit. I drove home from signing the final documents and sat in my truck in the driveway again. Same truck, same driveway, same me. But everything was different, and nothing looked different, and I wasn't sure whether to cry or laugh or what, so I just sat there for a while. Then I went inside and made dinner and watched the news. The news. That's where this comes back around. 3 weeks after the deal closed, there was a feature piece, not a press release, a real reported feature in an engineering industry publication that had a broader readership than you might expect. It went online on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, it had been picked up by 3 regional news outlets. By Thursday evening, it had been picked up by a national wire service. The headline was something like "Retired County Engineer's Assessment Tool Could Reshape Bridge Safety Inspections Across the U.S." My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. It was Patrick. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it since he was a teenager and he'd done something wrong and was trying to figure out how to tell me. A kind of tightly controlled panic. He said, Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. I said, okay. He said, is this you? This article. The engineer from Mercer County. Is this you? I said, yes. There was a long pause. Not a comfortable one. He said, how long has this been going on? I said, 7 years working on the methodology. About a year building the software. The deal closed 3 weeks ago. Another pause. He said, why didn't you tell us? I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was, because you stopped asking. Because somewhere in the year after your mother died, you decided I was a problem to be managed. And you stopped being curious about what I was doing and started just trying to keep me at a distance that was comfortable for you. Because when I said working on a project, you made that sound and changed the subject, and I let you. Because I was tired of explaining myself to people who'd already decided what I was. I didn't say any of that. I said, I didn't know if it was going to amount to anything. He said, Dad. I said, Patrick. He said, I'm sorry. About Thanksgiving. About all of it. I should have. We should have. I said, it's okay. He said, it's okay. He said, it's not okay. He said, it's not okay. He was right. It wasn't okay. But it wasn't unforgivable either. And I knew the difference. Shelby called the next morning. Her voice sounded different than it had in that kitchen in November. Less careful. More human. She said, I owe you an apology, Leonard. A real one, not a polite one. I said, I'm listening. She said, I told Patrick you were too much. That having you around was too much. I said that, and I meant it when I said it, and I've spent the last 8 months thinking it was true. And this morning I woke up and I don't know if it was or it wasn't. But I know I handled it badly. I should have talked to you. I should have been honest with you instead of just... She stopped, started again. Instead of just cutting you off and pretending it was for everyone's benefit. I said, Shelby, did you know my wife for 15 years? She said yes. I said, Connie thought you were good for Patrick. She told me that. She said you were the one who'd keep him honest. That meant something to her, and it means something to me. You made one bad call. People make bad calls. She cried a little. I'm not going to describe it in detail because it's private. But she cried, and I waited, and when she was done, we talked for another 40 minutes about ordinary things. About Owen's soccer, about Macy's reading, about a trip they were thinking about taking in the summer. It was the longest conversation I'd had with her in probably 2 years. Nora called that afternoon. She'd seen the article, and she called, and I could hear her trying to decide whether to be excited or guilty. She settled on excited, which was the right call. She said, Dad, this is incredible, I said. It's been a long year. She said, why didn't you call me? I said. Same reason I didn't call Patrick. I didn't want to talk about it until it was real. She said, is that the only reason? I let the question sit for a moment. I said, no, not entirely. She said, I haven't been around enough. I said, you have your own life. She said, you are part of my life. I said, I know. That was enough for that conversation. Sometimes things don't need to be fully unpacked right away. Sometimes you just establish that you're both still there, still in it, and you let the rest follow. Owen, my 13-year-old grandson, texted me that evening. I don't text well, I'll admit that. It takes me a long time and my thumbs don't cooperate. But I read his message 4 or 5 times. He wrote, Grandpa, I saw the news thing. That's so cool. Did you really build the software yourself? I wrote back, yes. It took a while, but yes. He wrote, can I see it sometime? I wrote, anytime you want. He wrote, okay. Also, Mom and Dad seem like they feel bad. Just so you know. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sent back a thumbs up, which felt inadequate. But Owen didn't seem to mind. I want to tell you something I've thought about a lot since all of this happened, because I don't think this story is really about the software or the deal or the article, not at the core of it. My wife used to say there are two kinds of quiet people in any room. There are people who are quiet because they have nothing to say, and there are people who are quiet because they've decided it isn't worth the energy to say it out loud. She said the second kind are usually the most dangerous, because eventually something comes out. It always comes out, and when it does, it's been building pressure for a long time. I don't think I'm dangerous, but I think she was right about the pressure. I spent 31 years being the person in the room who caught the thing everyone else missed. The low distribution error on a drawing that looked right but wasn't. The soil report that didn't account for seasonal water table variation. The assumption baked into an old design that only looks wrong if you go back and read the original code from 1968. And that's not a glamorous skill. Nobody buys you a drink for it. But it matters. It has always mattered. And somewhere in the year after Connie died, my family looked at me and saw a problem. An inconvenient presence. Someone whose opinions grated and whose attention was unwelcome, and who needed to be managed rather than engaged. And instead of telling them they were wrong, instead of fighting it, I went quiet in a different way. I went to my kitchen table and I worked. I'm not saying the outcome justifies the silence. I'm not saying any of this went the way it should have gone. What I'm saying is that sometimes you can't make people see what they're not ready to see, and the only thing you can do is keep building until you've built something they can't ignore. I ate a turkey breast alone on Thanksgiving. In February, I had a working prototype. In June, I signed a deal. In July, my son called at 11:47 p.m., his voice uncertain and young in a way I hadn't heard in years, asking if it was really me. It was really me. It had always been really me. That was the thing none of us said out loud, but I think all of us understood by the end. I've been going back to Patrick's house for Sunday dinners lately. Shelby makes something different every week. She's been going through a phase of making things from scratch that sensible people buy at the store. Bread and pasta, and last week a cheese that I was skeptical of, but that turned out to be excellent. I sit at the table and I eat, and I watch Owen explain things to Macy that she already knows, and I listen to Patrick talk about work, and I offer opinions occasionally when I can't help it. Sometimes Shelby raises an eyebrow at me when I start in on something, and sometimes I stop, and sometimes I don't. And once last month she laughed, actually laughed, not politely but genuinely, and said, "Okay, Leonard, you were right about the drainage. You've been right about the drainage for 3 years. We get it." That was a good evening. I still talk to Connie sometimes late at night. I tell her about the dinners and about the article and about the negotiations and about Owen wanting to see the software. I tell her about the Sunday Patrick called at 11:47 p.m., the uncertainty in his voice, the way he said "I'm sorry" like he meant it. She would have had a lot to say about all of it. She always had a lot to say. I don't know if what my family did to me over those months was forgivable or unforgivable. I've thought about it, and I've decided that framing it as a question of forgiveness isn't actually useful. What I know is that they're my people, the ones who are left. And the silence we all kept, the things we didn't say to each other, the ways we let distance grow. That silence wasn't peace. It only looked like peace from the outside. I know a little something about things that look solid from the outside and aren't. You can run the calculations. You can look at the load distribution. You can read the original design assumptions and see exactly where the flaw was built in, sometimes 30 years before anything shows up on an inspection report. The structure holds until it doesn't, and then you fix it. That's what you do. You find the failure point and you fix it, and you document everything, and you do better work going forward. That's all any of us can do. Walter called me last week. He said the firm in Atlanta had their first contract using the assessment tool, a state dot in the southeast, 47 bridges in the first evaluation cycle. He said the early results are good. Flagged 3 structures that the standard inspection process had rated as low priority. I said, "How low priority?" He said, 2 of them would have been on the high traffic list for next year's maintenance cycle. 1 of them was not on any list. I said, "Which one?" He said, "County Road Bridge, built in 1971, daily traffic about 800 vehicles. I thought about that. 800 vehicles a day. Every day. People going to work, going to school, going home. I said, good. He said, yeah, good. I sat with that for a while after we hung up. I thought about the 31 years I spent doing this work for no one in particular, for a county that paid me a salary and occasionally gave me a plaque. I thought about the school gymnasium and the 2019 earthquake and the article in the paper I read alone. I thought about 7 years of personal lab notebooks, and the winter I spent at my kitchen table teaching myself to write code, and the Thanksgiving I spent eating alone, and the night my son called at 11:47 p.m., not knowing what he was going to find on the other end of the line. People ask me if I'm angry at Patrick and Shelby. I understand why they ask. The honest answer is, I was for a while. Not a hot anger. I don't really do hot anger. But a cold and heavy one. The kind that sits in your chest and makes everything feel a little more effortful than it should be. I don't think I carry it anymore. I think it went somewhere. Maybe I burned it for fuel. The bridge doesn't know why the engineer fixed it. The 800 cars a day don't know. It doesn't matter in the end. The structure holds or it doesn't. The work is real or it isn't. Mine was real. That's the thing I knew all along, and the thing that took everyone else a little longer to understand, and the thing I have no interest in holding over anyone's head for the rest of my life. You build the thing. You make it true. You let it speak for itself. Then you go home and make dinner and watch the news and wait for the phone to ring. I've thought a lot about what actually happened here. Not the deal, not the article, not the phone call at 11:47 p.m., but the sequence of it. The way one thing led to the next in the line so straight it almost feels designed, even though I know it wasn't. Life doesn't design things. People make choices, and choices have weight. And eventually that weight lands somewhere. Shelby made a choice to manage me out instead of talk to me straight. Patrick made a choice to stand by the counter and say nothing. I made a choice to stop explaining myself and go quiet in a different direction. Toward the work, toward the table, toward 7 years of notebooks and 1 winter of learning to write code at 62. Those weren't random decisions. They all came from somewhere, and they all went somewhere. That's what I mean when I say I think about the sequence. Not in a way that assigns blame, I'm past that, genuinely, but in a way that tries to be honest about causes and effects. If Shelby had talked to me directly in September, instead of managing me out in November, maybe I never spend that Thanksgiving alone. Maybe I never burn that particular kind of cold fuel that kept me at the table every morning through January and February. Maybe the software gets finished eventually, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I only know what actually happened. What I've come to believe is this. The quality of your choices under pressure is the only real measure of character. Not when things are easy, not when your family is warm and your place at the table is secure, when you've been told you're too much, when you're eating alone on a holiday in the house where you raised your kids, when the person you'd normally talk to isn't there anymore. What you do in that specific silence says everything about who you actually are. I kept working, not to prove something, not to make anyone feel bad later. I kept working because the work was real, and because being real about something, being genuinely committed to something true, is the only dignity available to a person when everything social has been stripped away. That's not a philosophy I read somewhere. That's what the winter taught me. Integrity is what you do when no one is watching and no one would know the difference. I had 7 years of lab notebooks that nobody asked to see. I had a prototype I ran on a Tuesday in February with no audience. I had calculations that were either right or wrong regardless of whether my son returned my calls. The work didn't care that I ate alone on Thanksgiving. It only cared whether I'd done it correctly. And that, I think, is the thing worth passing on. Not the deal, not the money, not the vindication of the phone call. The part worth keeping is smaller and harder, that you can lose your seat at the table and still not lose your purpose. That the people who matter most to you can misread you completely, and you can survive it, not by hardening, but by going deeper into whatever's actually true about you. Patrick and Shelby came back. Nora called. Owen texted me wanting to see the software. That matters to me. I want to be clear that it matters, but it would have mattered less. The return would have felt hollow if I hadn't had something real to come back to. The reconciliation only meant something because I hadn't spent those months just waiting to be wanted again. I'd been build the thing, do it right. Let it be true. The rest has a way of following.